Okay, so the last thing that I want to do is say, listen, we now have all these methods for studying development, but what is it that babies actually look at? What do they see? What do they smell? What do they hear? So we're going to talk about newborn sensory systems, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of detail about what we know about what newborns can see, what they can hear, what they can taste, what they can smell, and a little bit about their sense of touch. So again, the senses that you and I have, we want to basically say, how do these senses start off? Do babies are they able to see anything? Can they hear anything? What about what they taste? Do they have any preferences? So we're just going to talk a little bit about that. So one thing that we can do is ask, well, what is it that babies see? So how is it that we test vision? Unfortunately, we can't have babies go into the eye doctor and say, okay, is this better or is this better? Can you read line 8? Right? Babies, when they're newborns, can't really move their heads. They can't really do a whole heck of a lot that you and I can do to be able to tell a doctor what we can see. So what is it that they do? One of the things that we see is that preferential looking is a method that's used. So basically, do babies show a preference for something over something else? If they can show a preference, it tells us that they can tell the difference between two things, but also gives us an idea for what they may prefer to look at. And do all babies prefer to look at the same thing? So one of the people that has done this, this is back in like the 50s, was a researcher by the last name of Fance. Again, don't worry about last names, but know what the findings are. So basically what Fance did is present babies with preference studies and said, so if you look at this picture, there's a researcher up at the top who's presenting two different stimuli to a baby and looking at which one they prefer to look at. So for instance, they wanted to know, do babies show preference, say, if you see a face versus just something else that's a little bit complex, like newsprint? Or what about newsprint versus a bullseye? Or colored versus non-colored? Do babies show preferences? What is it that babies like to look at? And what they found was this, that babies would prefer and look longest at things like faces rather than, say, just a colored circle. But we do see that they show preference for a face over things that are even pretty complex, like newsprint, but that in general, the pattern that we see is that babies prefer to look at things of high contrast. So this is why if you're buying a toy for someone for, say, a baby shower, you don't just want to go with the pretty yellow and blue ones, you want to go with something that's high contrast. So you may have seen that there's products where they have kind of these black and white figures with really high contrast to present to babies like mobiles for in their cribs. We actually know science can tell us what are the best kinds of things to put on these mobiles. It can tell us what are the best designs to use on baby toys. So next time you're in the store and trying to buy a gift for a baby, keep this in mind. The babies prefer high contrast. Okay, why might they prefer high contrast? Well, one reason is because if we look at their acuity or how good or how accurate their vision is, this is actually what babies will see. So a newborn, say that you're in a crib, lying on your back. Remember the back to sleep campaign, so being a good parent, your parents lied you on your back. You look up at your mobile. When you're a newborn, this is what you can see. You're not completely blind, but you don't really see colors very well. You're not great here in terms of vision, but over a month, you're starting to get better. 2 months, 3 months, you're getting pretty good. 4 months, and adulthood. Right, so by about 4 months, their vision is so much better than it was when they were a newborn, which partly explains why babies prefer high contrast. They prefer high contrast because that's basically where their visual system is. If you think at 1 month, you are mostly going to see the things that really, really contrast, like a black and white thing, versus yellow and green that are pretty similar to each other because your vision just isn't that accurate yet. So we see that acuity really increases over the first like 4 months of development. So we can look at those changes in vision. Another thing we can look at is visual scanning. In other words, what is it that infants like to look at? So for instance, if we were to bring a baby to President Barack Obama, where would the baby look? What would the baby look at? Now, for those of you that have had interactions with babies, you may notice that as they get older, what they look at changes, which is to say that little babies tend to look and kind of zone out at one thing, rather than kind of looking all around. So in a study to look at this, they basically presented 2 weeks old and 12-week-olds with a stimulus, and they looked at a video camera that recorded where the baby would fixate or where kind of their eyes would fixate, where they would look. And you see that at 2 weeks, babies kind of fixate in one spot and kind of just look right around that spot. Versus at 12 weeks, they kind of look all over. They're looking at the sides, the top, the bottom of something. And that they're making more frequent eye movements and that they're looking kind of for shorter looks, but all over. Whereas at 2-week old, they're looking for a really long period of time at one thing. So in this example, a 2-week old would look, say, just at President Barack Obama's chin and just kind of stare at it for a while. Maybe look at the corner of a lip, but then go back to the chin. Whereas a 12-week-old will look at ears and eyes and noses and mouths. So we see that there's increased scanning with age. Finally, something else we can look at is, well, what is it that babies actually perceive about faces? So in this example, they would present babies with faces that look like this. And they said, well, what is it that babies like to look at? And this is seconds of fixation in a 2-minute test. So how much time are they spending looking at A, B, and C? As you can see, the green line is A. Babies prefer to look at A. Basically, babies kind of know what faces are supposed to look like, so they're going to look at faces longer. They'll look at B almost as long. Basically, they're saying, this has kind of the components of of a regular face, of A. It's kind of spread out, and there's high contrast, so I'm going to look at that. But it's not just a matter of saying there's more darkness on the top than on the bottom, because if we present them with C, they look significantly less. So babies prefer to look at upright faces. So this gives us an idea of what babies are seeing. What is it that, let's say, they hear? So if we move on to the sense of hearing. We actually know that babies prefer language versus not language. We've talked about that one before. So even within a few days of birth, if you give babies a preference study where if they present on one set of speakers, words like broccoli is green, it doesn't really make a difference what the content is, but it's language, versus another sound like dogs barking or random noises, babies are going to prefer language. So babies, even really early on, can tell the difference between language versus not language, and they prefer language. And again, it doesn't make a difference what the content is. So if you present them with beeps versus time to take a bath, babies prefer language. We also know that babies prefer motherese versus adult speech. Motherese is kind of that exaggerated way that we all will talk to babies. So if you see a baby and you say, "Hi baby, aren't you a pretty baby?" versus, "Hello baby, aren't you a pretty baby?" Right, so this basically tells us that babies can tell the difference, and in general, babies prefer that exaggerated language. So they're more likely to listen to it and listen to it for longer. In terms of taste and smell, we can look at that. We know that babies will show different responses to sweet taste versus sour, bitter, or salty tastes, and that they will respond to foul odors. What does it tell us that the fact that there's a universal response? If we want to look at, how does taste develop or how does sensitivity to smell develop? If it's an impact of biology, we would expect there to be a universal response so that all babies across the globe, regardless of experience, would respond the way to, say, sour flavors. But we can also know that nurture impacts the response as well. So basically, what impact does it have if a baby is raised, say the carrot juice example. Those babies who were raised and prenatally were exposed to carrot juice show a differential response to carrot juice. So we see that there's actually impacts of nature and nurture in terms of the response to taste and smell. But we do see that there's a decent amount of universal response so that babies will respond the same way. If you look at that bottom picture, if you give them lemon, babies are going to make that face. The top, they're going to respond well if you put sugar water into their mouth. They'll all kind of respond with this upturned smile. They'll like it. The sour face will make them make the bottom face. So we see that there's both an impact of nature and nurture in terms of response to taste and smell. The last thing I want to talk about is how there's a little bit of a difference between, we don't just look at sensory systems by themselves. We can also look at how vision, hearing, taste, smell, or touch combine with each other. So in instance, can babies match up what they hear with what they see? Can they match up what they feel with kind of what they see? So here's an example. This is one of the last things I want to talk about. And basically what they did is they presented babies with a pacifier, something like this that they've never seen before. They didn't let the babies actually see it. They put this pacifier into the baby's mouth, kind of let them explore it. So they're kind of sucking on it for a while. One of these pacifiers kind of had these little nubs on it, and they basically then gave the baby these pacifiers, and then they let them look at either one. Turns out that by 30 days old, or 29 days old actually, babies preferred to look at the one that they explored in their mouth. They preferred to look at the one that matched what they felt with what they saw. So we can actually see this intermodal perception, intermodality, so different, like your different senses, they can actually match those two senses up. And we see that babies are able to do that with things like lip movements and speech sounds. So they match, if they were to see me speak and they want to hear the same thing that they're seeing me. So it's kind of like if you ever watch a movie or Netflix, streaming Netflix, when the sound's just a little bit off and it's bothersome, babies are really sensitive to that too. Whether it goes with speech sounds like ba ba or da da, or even passages, so again, things like Netflix. And finally, they prefer to look if the speaker's voice matches the gender. So if you have a male and a female say the exact same thing in the exact same way, babies prefer to look at the speaker whose gender matches the sound that they're hearing. So babies not only have this ability to take in sensory information, but they actually can do really cool things in terms of matching across those different senses. So hopefully this gives you an idea of some of the really impressive things that babies can do and gives us an idea of what sensory input they have, what they're sensitive to, and kind of what they're building from. You figure babies have a lot to learn, but they're starting off strong in terms of all of these abilities. So that's all I want to talk about here. And then in class on Thursday, we're going to talk a little bit about Piaget and learning. So please let me know if you have any questions, and make sure that you remember that your anytime assignment is due at the beginning of class on Thursday.